We are taught from childhood that a marriage ending is the ultimate mark of personal failure, a permanent stain on your judgment and your character. But staying in a relationship that requires you to slowly diminish who you are just to keep an old contract alive isn't a victory. It is a quiet, prolonged sacrifice of your mental health and your future. When you shift your perspective from viewing a split as a catastrophic defeat to seeing it as a necessary course correction, your entire understanding of human happiness changes. If you don't recognize the patterns showing that an ending is actually a vital recalibration, you risk spending your only life paying for a choice made by a younger, less informed version of yourself. There are deeply hidden dynamics that explain exactly why a separation can be the most mature decision you ever make. And we need to look closely at how these patterns show up in a home before you waste another year waiting for a reality that cannot change. The first clear sign that an ending is actually a correction happens when you find yourself completely paralyzed by what people casually call the forever trap. This is that heavy, suffocating feeling where you stay in a deeply unhappy situation simply because you have already invested 5, 10, or 20 years into it, and you cannot bear the thought of that time being wasted. From a psychological standpoint, our brains are naturally wired to avoid loss at all costs, which often causes us to make incredibly irrational choices. We convince ourselves that if we just hold on a little longer, endure a little more neglect, or suffer through another year of silence, we can somehow retroactively justify the time we've already given away. You stop looking at what the relationship is actually providing you in the present moment, and you start acting like a gambler who keeps pouring money into a broken slot machine, hoping the next pull will fix the deficit. This pattern turns a marriage into an endurance contest where the only prize for staying is the continued loss of your own peace. To see how this operates in a real life, consider a man named Marcus, who spent his entire 30s miserable in a marriage where he and his wife lived completely separate, cold lives. They hadn't shared a meaningful conversation or a moment of physical affection in over 7 years. But Marcus refused to leave because he kept thinking about the house they built, the family vacations they planned, and the decade of effort he had poured into the relationship. He told himself that walking away meant admitting that a third of his life was a total waste of time. So he stayed, becoming increasingly depressed and bitter with each passing season. It wasn't until he turned 42 that he finally realized the time was already gone, and by staying out of obligation to the past, he was actively stealing his remaining good years from himself. When he finally filed for divorce, he didn't feel like a failure. He felt an overwhelming wave of relief because he realized he was finally stopping the bleeding and choosing to protect the decades he had left. This trap is so incredibly dangerous because it uses your own loyalty, your history, and your work ethic against you. You think you are being strong and resilient by staying, but you are actually allowing a fear of the unknown to dictate your entire existence. In any other area of life, if you realized a path was leading you into a dead end, you would turn around and find a new route without a second thought. But because society has placed this massive, heavy moral weight on the concept of marriage, we treat a necessary U-turn like a total character flaw. We have to realize that walking away from a relationship that cannot heal isn't throwing away your past. It is a brave, conscious decision to stop throwing away your future. It is an acknowledgement that you have learned the lesson the relationship had to teach you, and you are finally ready to apply that wisdom to a life that actually allows you to breathe. Another major sign that a split is a healthy correction is when you recognize you have entered the pattern people call outgrowing the baseline. This occurs when two people marry very young or during a phase of life where their identities are not yet fully formed, and as the decades pass, they evolve into completely incompatible adults with entirely different values, needs, and worldviews. Psychologically, human beings are not static organisms. We are constantly shifting, learning, and adapting to our life experiences. Sometimes, the person you were at 22 needs something radically different than the person you become at 35, and if the marriage was built entirely on those youthful, outdated needs, the foundation will naturally begin to crack. When this happens, the gap between you isn't caused by a lack of love or a sudden burst of cruelty. It is simply the natural result of two individuals growing in completely opposite directions until they no longer share a common language. I remember working with a woman named Sarah, who married her college sweetheart when they were both 23 years old and entirely focused on building a secure, conventional suburban life. Over the next 12 years, Sarah went through a profound internal shift, learning to prioritize her emotional health, discovering a passion for a highly creative career, and realizing she needed a deeply communicative, emotionally vulnerable partner. Her husband, however, remained exactly the same person he was in college, perfectly content with absolute predictability, completely closed off to emotional discussions, and deeply uncomfortable with any form of personal change. Sarah spent years feeling incredibly guilty for her own evolution, trying to force herself back into the tiny box of who she used to be just to keep her husband comfortable. The day she realized that divorce was the only option was the day she accepted that neither she nor her husband were bad people. They were just two completely different adults who no longer fit into a contract written by two kids. This type of ending is a profound correction because it honors the truth of who you both are in the present moment, rather than forcing both of you to live a lie out of habit. When you try to sustain a marriage where the baseline has completely eroded, you end up living with a constant, simmering resentment because you are always asking your partner to be someone they are not, or they are always asking you to stop growing. It is a slow, agonizing process where both people are quietly starving for the kind of connection they actually need, but neither can provide it because their core identities are simply mismatched. Choosing to end that dynamic isn't a malicious act. It is an act of deep respect that releases both individuals to find partners who actually align with their mature selves. It allows you to say that the marriage was successful for the season it belonged to, but that staying any longer would require you to commit a form of slow emotional suicide. The third sign that points to divorce being a necessary correction is when the relationship is rooted in a pattern that people call the rescue mission marriage. This happens when one person enters the partnership unconsciously acting as a savior, marrying someone who is deeply broken, struggling with unhealed trauma, or completely unstable, under the illusion that their love will eventually fix them. From a psychological perspective, this is often a replication of old childhood dynamics where you felt you had to earn love by managing the chaos of a parent or a sibling. You mistake the intense, exhausting high of managing another person's crises for true romantic intimacy, and you build your entire marital identity on being the strong, reliable, indispensable fixer. But eventually, the savior grows tired of being drained, or the person being rescued begins to resent the constant caretaking, and the artificial bond begins to completely unravel. Think about a man named David, who married a woman with a severe, untreated emotional volatility, completely convinced that his steady, calm, and infinitely patient nature would provide the safe environment she needed to finally heal. He spent nearly 9 years walking on eggshells, managing her explosive outbursts, covering for her mistakes, and completely sacrificing his own friendships, hobbies, and emotional needs to keep her stable. David thought he was being an exemplary, heroic husband, but he was actually completely trapped in an enabling cycle that allowed his wife to avoid doing the hard, independent work of seeking professional help. When David finally hit a wall of absolute physical and emotional burnout, he realized that his marriage wasn't a partnership at all. It was a full-time caretaking job that was slowly destroying his own mental stability. Leaving the marriage was his way of finally resigning from a position he was never meant to hold, a massive correction that forced him to realize he was only responsible for saving himself. When you break free from a rescue mission marriage, the divorce is a massive correction because it marks the exact moment you choose to heal your own underlying wounds. It is the moment you stop believing that your worth as a human being is tied to how much suffering you can absorb on behalf of another adult. These relationships are incredibly toxic because they masquerade as deep, unconditional love, when they are actually built on a foundation of mutual dependency and fear. Walking away requires an immense amount of courage because you have to tolerate the guilt of leaving someone who is struggling, but it is often the only way to save your own life from being dragged down by their unresolved chaos. It is a profound realization that you cannot love someone into wholeness if they are not actively choosing to do the heavy lifting themselves. The fourth pattern that transforms a divorce from a failure into a vital correction is when the marriage is sustained entirely by what people casually call the phantom future. This is a state of relationship limbo where you are no longer in love with the actual human being sitting across from you in the kitchen, but you are deeply, passionately in love with the idea of who they might become next year, or who they used to be 5 years ago. Psychologically, this happens as a survival mechanism when the present reality of your home life becomes too painful or neglectful to tolerate. Your mind copes with the daily disappointment by inventing a fantasy timeline where your spouse finally goes to counseling, finally stops drinking, finally starts paying attention to you, or finally treats you with basic respect. You spend years living in a mental projection, basing your major life decisions on a potential version of your partner that does not exist anywhere except inside your own hopeful imagination. To see how this pattern slowly drains a person's life, look at what happened with a couple named Chloe and Robert. Robert had a chronic habit of making promises he had absolutely no intention of keeping. He would promise to help more around the house, promise to stop overspending their shared savings, and promise to find a stable job. Chloe spent nearly 8 years staying in the relationship, telling her worried family members that Robert had a good heart and was just about to turn a corner because he had a new business idea or a new self-help book. She was constantly waiting for the real Robert to show up, ignoring the clear evidence of his daily laziness and lack of respect. The day Chloe finally realized she needed to file for divorce was the day she looked at him and asked herself a terrifying question. If he never changes a single thing for the next 30 years, would I still stay? The honest answer was an absolute no, and she realized she had been married to a ghost of a future that was never going to arrive. When you choose to end a relationship that is stuck in the phantom future, the divorce is a profound correction because it marks the exact moment you choose to live in truth. It is an act of radical acceptance where you stop trying to edit, fix, or ignore the objective reality of the person you are with. Staying in a marriage based entirely on potential is a form of slow emotional torture because you are always living in anticipation of a change that your partner has no desire to make. When you finally walk away, you aren't quitting on a marriage. You are simply refusing to spend any more of your limited time on Earth waiting in a waiting room that has no door. It allows you to reclaim your agency and invest your energy into a life that is grounded in what is, rather than what might be if a miracle suddenly occurs. The fifth and final sign that a separation is a necessary course correction is when the relationship has completely devolved into a toxic loop people call the performance marriage. This is a dynamic where the partnership looks absolutely flawless from the outside. You have the beautiful house, the coordinated family photos, the financial stability, and the polite conversations at dinner parties. But inside the walls of your own home, the connection is utterly dead. From a psychological perspective, this happens when two people value societal approval, family expectations, and the external appearance of success far more than their own internal well-being. You stay together because you are terrified of what the neighbors will say, how your parents will react, or how a split will disrupt your social standing. You become actors in a highly scripted play, putting on a smile for the audience while suffering from a profound, suffocating loneliness the moment the curtains close and you are left alone in the dark with your spouse. Consider a woman named Jessica and her husband Tom, who were widely considered the dream couple in their tight-knit suburban community. They threw elaborate backyard barbecues, coached their kids' sports teams together, and always presented a completely united front to the world. Privately, however, they had slept in separate bedrooms for 6 years, spoke to each other only in cold, transactional logistics about their schedules, and shared a deep, unspoken hostility that poisoned the atmosphere of the house whenever the kids weren't in the room. Jessica spent her nights crying in the guest bathroom, feeling like an absolute fraud because she was sacrificing her soul to maintain an illusion for people who only saw them for a few hours a week. When she finally decided to break the script and file for divorce, her community was completely shocked, and some even criticized her for walking away from a perfect life. But for Jessica, ending the performance was the most authentic thing she had ever done. A massive correction that allowed her to stop trading her actual sanity for the comfort of public opinion. Breaking free from a performance marriage is a vital correction because it reestablishes your integrity as a human being, forcing you to align your internal reality with your external life. When you stay in a relationship just for appearances, you are teaching yourself and often your children that looking happy is far more important than actually being happy. It is a highly exhausting way to live, and it inevitably breeds a deep, corrosive cynicism about love, honesty, and connection. Choosing to end the illusion requires an incredible amount of raw bravery because you have to be willing to let people misunderstand you, gossip about you, or judge you for the sake of your own emotional survival. But on the other side of that temporary social discomfort is the immense, life-changing freedom of a life that is completely honest, where you no longer have to pretend to love a shadow just to keep everyone else comfortable. When you look at all of these dynamics together, it becomes beautifully clear that while a lifelong marriage is a wonderful ideal, walking away from a dead contract is not a sign of personal failure, but a brave, necessary act of self-respect that corrects your course toward a life of genuine truth, growth, and peace. If you take a completely honest look at the current state of your own life, do you feel like you are staying in your relationship to protect your history? Or are you ready to admit that your marriage needs a radical course correction? Subscribe to the channel. I break down a new psychological pattern in human behavior and relationships every single week.